Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we are zeroing in on exactly what the title says, NCP-MCI 7.5 to 9.2 supported migration paths. Now, if you're prepping for the exam, you already know that moving workloads efficiently across environments is basically a cornerstone of Nutanix architecture. So we're going to lock down exactly what you need to know about Nutanix Move, the critical prerequisites for different environments, and most importantly, the specific exam traps that might trip you up. Go ahead and get your notebooks ready because this is your ultimate exam prep session.
Okay, let's dive into our syllabus for today. First, we'll cover why migration paths matter. Then, we'll jump into some detailed migration walkthroughs. After that, we'll look at exam traps and edge cases, and finally, we'll wrap up with the key facts you absolutely have to memorize.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, why migration paths matter, and really just understanding the basics.
Before we get into the weeds, let's do a super quick acronym check, just to make sure we're all speaking the exact same language. I know as infrastructure admins, you probably dream in these acronyms, but precision is absolutely key for this exam. So NCP-MCI is of course our target certification. AHV stands for Acropolis Hypervisor. That's Nutanix's native enterprise-grade hypervisor. ESXi is VMware's hypervisor, which you're going to see frequently as a migration source in our scenarios. And finally, NC2 stands for Nutanix Cloud Clusters. And that's the tech that allows you to run the whole Nutanix stack natively on bare metal instances right in public clouds like AWS or Azure.
Now, our primary mechanism for actually getting virtual machines from point A to point B is Nutanix Move. Move is a cross-hypervisor mobility solution, and it's designed specifically to migrate VMs and files with incredibly minimal downtime. The exam is going to heavily test your knowledge of how Move interacts with different sources and targets, because, it's not just some basic copy-paste tool. It's actually a really sophisticated orchestration engine. It handles discovery, data seeding, and the final cutovers. Knowing precisely what it supports, and honestly, what it doesn't support, is half the battle for passing this section. So let's talk about the exact supported migration pairs you need to commit to memory. Try to notice the patterns here, because understanding this logic is really going to help you eliminate wrong answers on test day. If you're starting from VMware ESXi, you can move to Nutanix AHV, ESXi-on-Nutanix, or to NC2 on AWS or Azure. Microsoft Hyper-V actually has very similar flexibility. It allows migrations to AHV, ESXi-on-Nutanix, and NC2. And it's the same story even if you're pulling from public clouds like AWS EC2 or Azure Cloud instances. Nutanix Move fully supports bringing those workloads into Nutanix AHV, ESXi-on-Nutanix, or NC2. Definitely memorize these supported pairs because you will undoubtedly see a multiple choice question asking you to spot the unsupported path.
Moving right along to Section 2, detailed migration walkthroughs, going from source to target.
Let's jump straight into our first highly testable scenario, which is migrating from VMware ESXi to Nutanix AHV. When you're migrating from ESXi, Nutanix Move doesn't just, blindly guess what's out there. It communicates directly with vCenter. Because vCenter acts as the central management interface for those ESXi virtual machines, Move connects right to it using the management server and the source agent. That source agent's whole job is to efficiently collect information from the VMware library about the specific VMs that you're actually targeting for migration.
But before we list the exact ESXi prerequisites, we have another really critical acronym to define, CBT, or Changed Block Tracking. This is a native VMware feature that keeps track of the specific storage blocks that have changed since the last backup or snapshot. Nutanix Move relies heavily on CBT for efficient data seeding. It basically ensures Move only copies the delta, meaning just the data that has actually changed, rather than dragging the entire multi-gigabyte virtual disk over the network over and over again during the synchronization phase. It's a huge time saver.
Okay, grab your pens because you're absolutely going to want to write this down. These are prime exam questions. For an optimal ESXi to AHV migration, you must install the latest version of VMware tools on your source VMs. You also need to clear out all VM alerts in vCenter and refresh the inventory to make sure Move gets a perfectly clean read. You've got to ensure disk compatibility with CBT. And here is a massive one. You absolutely must disable fault tolerance for those VMs. Why? Because fault tolerance basically locks the VM state in a way that prevents the snapshotting that Move strictly requires. And finally, if a VM is CBT enabled, it must have fewer than 30 snapshots sitting in the inventory. If you see an exam scenario where a VM has 35 snapshots, you know right away that migration is going to fail.
Now let's pivot over to a Microsoft environment. If your source is Hyper-V, the rules completely change, and the exam fully expects you to intimately know the difference.
First up, Nutanix explicitly specifies that you have to use the Google Chrome browser for the Move UI. Crucially, and listen really closely to this version number, your environment must have PowerShell version 4.0 or later installed. Also, for the source VMs to be automatically prepared for the move, they need to have integration services installed. And you have to verify that an IP address is actually showing up in the networking section of the Hyper-V Manager.
Our third walkthrough covers migrating from the public cloud, specifically AWS EC2 or Azure instances, over to AHV. Again, we see that firm requirement for Google Chrome and PowerShell version 4.0 or later. But here are the cloud-specific edge cases you need to memorize. For Windows source VMs, you must disable User Account Control, or UAC, for the Windows Administrator user. If you're migrating Linux VMs, Network Security Services, or NSS, version 3.44 is strictly required. And finally, right before you initiate the migration, you have to ensure you disable any active backup schedules. You really don't want locked files messing up your sync process.
Which brings us to Section 3, Exam Traps and Edge Cases. These are the exceptions that test writers absolutely love.
Now, what's really interesting here is just how restrictive the rules get when we talk about Prism Central. You might naturally think, oh, I can just use Nutanix Move to migrate my Prism Central VM exactly like I would any other workload. Nope. That is a massive exam trap. Nutanix Move absolutely does not support the migration of Controller Microservices Platform, or CMSP-enabled Prism Central VMs. In fact, if your Prism Central instance is deployed on an ESXi or AHV hypervisor that is already running on Nutanix hardware, you can't use Nutanix Move at all. You actually have to use the Prism Central Disaster Recovery feature instead. The only time you can use Nutanix Move for Prism Central is if two very specific conditions are met. First, the Prism Central instance has to be deployed on a non-Nutanix ESXi environment. Second, the version must be 2022.6 or older, and the microservices platform must be disabled. Commit that exact exception to memory, for sure.
Next up, another super quick acronym check before we hit our next trap. NGT. That stands for Nutanix Guest Tools. It's a really powerful software package you install inside the guest virtual machine to enable advanced functionality. Stuff like self-service restore, application-consistent snapshots, and really seamless VM mobility.
And here is the NGT live migration trap. If the virtual machine in your source cluster has Nutanix Guest Tools enabled, that VM must have at least one empty IDE or SATA CD-ROM drive. You might be wondering, why on earth does it need an empty CD-ROM drive? Well, because the underlying system needs that empty virtual drive to mount the ISO that's required for reconfiguration on the destination cluster. So if you have an NGT-enabled VM that's fully populated with virtual drives and has absolutely no empty CD-ROM, your live migration is going to fail. The exam loves testing that exact why.
Speaking of live migration within AHV environments, there are a few essential rules you need to lock down. Both the source and the destination clusters must be running the exact same AHV version. Furthermore, the guest VM you want to live migrate must be powered on. I know that sounds super obvious, but it's an incredibly easy multiple-choice trick. If you're looking in the Prism Central web console during a practical scenario and you just can't find a specific VM to live migrate, it's highly likely because Prism Central actively filters out guest VMs that are powered off.
Let's look at one more edge case, an in-place cluster conversion from ESXi to AHV. When you're converting a cluster, before you start the process, you have to go into the vCenter UI, navigate specifically under Teaming and Failover, and you are strictly required to remove any unused network adapters. You must keep only the adapters that are active, and you have to ensure they are of the exact same speeds as the standby and active adapters. If you leave unused or mismatched speed adapters hanging around in that interface, the conversion process is going to hit a massive roadblock.
All right, home stretch. Section 4, key facts to memorize for your final exam prep. Let's lock in the big 4 exam facts. Number 1. Anytime you see Hyper-V, AWS, or Azure as a migration source, instantly think PowerShell version 4.0 or later and Google Chrome. Number 2. For ESXi sources utilizing changed block tracking, the hard architectural limit is fewer than 30 snapshots. Number 3. Prism Central migrations only use Nutanix Move if they're coming from a non-Nutanix ESXi host on version 2022.6 or older with the microservices platform disabled. Otherwise, you've got to use PC disaster recovery. And number 4, live migrating an NGT-enabled VM strictly requires an empty IDE or SATA CD-ROM to successfully attach that reconfiguration ISO.
To leave you with a quick, active recall test, if you're staring at an exam scenario where a Windows VM on Azure is migrating to HV and is suddenly failing during preparation, what specific setting did you forget? Did you remember to disable UAC for the Windows administrator user? Keep these precise prerequisites and traps fresh in your mind, and you are absolutely going to crush Section 9.2 of the NCP-MCI 7.5 certification. Thanks so much for joining me in this explainer, and best of luck on your exam.